Good afternoon. We are coming on the air with breaking news. Former President Donald Trump has made his choice. Mr. Trump just posted on his social media platform, Truth Social, that Ohio Senator JD Vance will be his running mate and Republican nominee for vice president ahead of this year's general election. So this year's Republican ticket will be Trump Vance. Senator Vance has been in the Senate for less than 2 years, but has aligned himself consistently with Mr. Trump during that time. The news comes just before they're both set to be formally nominated today on the first day of the Republican National Convention. It also comes less than 48 hours after the assassination attempt on Mr. Trump at his rally over the weekend, as well as just hours after the documents case was dismissed by the judge in Florida. Our senior Washington correspondent, Hallie Jackson, joins me live now with this breaking news. Yeah. Hallie, you and I have been working our sources throughout the day. Not a huge surprise because we learned that North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum was out. We learned that Senator Marco Rubio was out. How do you think the party faithful will respond to this pick?
JD Vance, the freshman first-term senator from Ohio, is widely seen, as you well know, Kristen, as the next generation of the MAGA movement, if you will. He is somebody who has had the strong and outspoken support of not just, clearly, former President Trump, but his son, Donald Trump Jr., who's been a big advocate for JD Vance all along. And in conversations with sources before this moment, one of the things that I've heard is that Senator Vance could be helpful to the former president in some of those rural, exurban areas of some of these critical Rust Belt states, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania. Listen, those are not places where former President Trump would have likely been at risk of not doing well, but perhaps on the turnout push, there is some indication that that is where they like JD Vance. They like Senator Vance. You have the former president in this Truth Social today saying that after lengthy deliberation and thought and considering the tremendous talents of many others, he has decided, of course, that the person, as he says, best suited to assume the position is, in fact, Senator Vance. You can see that post here. And this comes at a moment, Kristen, where we are just minutes away from this ticket becoming, let's call it officially official, no longer presumptive, with former President Trump any minute now set to go, as we call it, over the top and get enough delegates to lock up the nomination. I can tell you based on my reporting, and I know you've been working your sources too, the other two contenders on the short list, as NBC News had reported, was Florida Senator Marco Rubio and North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum. I am told by a source that as it relates to Senator Rubio, there was a concern about that residency requirement, about both men being in the same place. That is partly why they felt like they couldn't get to a good resolution on that. He's not the pick, and I know you've been talking to your Burgum sources too.
I have been, and look, Burgum was widely seen, Hallie, as someone who would have been safe. He would have never overshadowed Donald Trump. And the pick of JD Vance is so fascinating. This is The Apprentice pick in some ways.
The drama, the intrigue on this pick.
And he's really seen as the future of the MAGA movement. Now, there are some who are worried. Will this resonate with moderates, with independents, with those Nikki Haley voters who Donald Trump needs to win over if he wants to win this election, Hallie?
It's a great point, and I think that part of the calculus here, too, with Senator Vance has been the way, listen, we know Donald Trump. We know what the former president likes. He likes people who speak out strongly and forcefully on his behalf. And boy, Senator Vance has certainly made the rounds doing that over the course of the former president's campaign here. Wasn't always that way, as I know we'll get into, but there is obviously a sense of installing somebody here, I think clearly based on this pick and reading through this long Truth Social again that lays out, of course, JD Vance's resume here, this online post, a sense that he will be somebody who is loyal to former President Trump. All of it, of course, we have to note, as this convention, I mean, this is literally just the beginning of this significant moment for the Republican Party, and it's taken on a different tone, of course, since that assassination attempt against former President Trump less than 48 hours ago. He is now here in Milwaukee at this critical moment for the party, the first time that we have seen a vice presidential pick rolled out this century, in a couple of decades, at a convention and not before.
The history is just fascinating. Hallie, let's bring in our Capitol Hill correspondent, Ryan Nobles. Ryan, of course, this pick comes against the backdrop just days after that assassination attempt against former President Trump. So there is a bit of a somber feeling as well that is kicking off this convention. We should say, you hear the noise behind me. They are in the process of officially nominating Donald Trump to be their party's nominee, and we are just moments away from getting to Ohio, the home state of JD Vance. What are you hearing there, Ryan?
Well, Kristen, I think that for many of us on Capitol Hill, JD Vance was thought to be the front runner in this contest from almost the very beginning. He was someone thought of to be very loyal to Donald Trump, especially when he made the decision to run for elective office. Of course, JD Vance's story is a pretty remarkable American story, someone that was born into poverty, spending time in both Kentucky and Ohio. He, of course, was the author of that blockbuster book, Hillbilly Elegy, which came out right around the time Donald Trump was elected president back in 2016. And it became, in many ways, a thesis of the average American in middle America who resonated and connected with Donald Trump. And in many ways, JD Vance was called upon to try and decode the explanations behind which someone like Donald Trump could resonate with that community, because he was someone who understood the people of those communities. Now, it's important to point out that initially JD Vance was not a very strong supporter of Donald Trump. He was very critical of him throughout the 2016 campaign. But as time went on, after Donald Trump won that election, and when Vance himself began to explore the idea of political office, he became more and more aligned with the MAGA movement, became very close with Donald Trump Jr. and members of the Trump family. And then when he decided to run for the seat that was being left open by Rob Portman in Ohio, that's when he really fully embraced the MAGA movement and really ran as a MAGA candidate and successfully collected Donald Trump's nomination in that primary process, which played a big role in securing that primary and then ultimately seeing him elected to the United States Senate. He's someone without a lot of governing experience, right? He was just elected to the Senate back in 2022, so he hasn't even served a full 2 years. He does not have a great deal of seniority as a result of that. In fact, he's the second youngest member of the United States Senate. So this is an interesting pick, a compelling one for President Trump.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.